So, hello everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of ClueCon Weekly. Joining us today is Alec Fenichel from TransNexus. Is a software developer and expert in all things store shaking and various aspects of traffic. So, thank you, Alec, for joining us today.
Thank you, Luca, for having me.
Would you like to give us a quick introduction about yourself, your career? It's always interesting for people to see where we come from.
Yeah, so I've been working at TransNexus since I believe 2015. Um, that's really been the bulk of what I've been doing. It's evolved over time. I kind of started off doing a little bit more, front end, and then switched into back end development. At TransNexus, evolved a little bit. Now I do a little bit more, standards development. Working on standards groups to develop things like the stir staking standards, and but still some software development, which is always nice. Before that, I did a couple, little other things. I did some work at BMW on automated vehicles. But TransNexus has been the bulk of my career.
Good. So, yeah, you're from Atlanta, right?
Yes.
I spent a lot of time down there. Cool. So, yeah, I think the first thing to start from is probably I think TransNexus is mostly known for the ClearIP platform. So maybe we can start from there. So if you could let us know what it is, what it does, who can use, who is it useful for, and we go from there.
Yeah. So the ClearIP platform is a software as a service platform. Maybe just a little bit of history. TransNexus has been around for a long time, since I believe 1997, developing BSS, OSS, call routing solutions, really. And ClearIP was an initiative that I led when I joined TransNexus, which was basically to take the on-premise software that was really more applicable to larger carriers, just due to the costs of deploying and standing up something in their network, and provide that kind of similar functionality in a software as a service model. So ClearIP was really a complete start over. There's no shared code between our two platforms, but it is built on the business principles, the things that we learned from the past decade and a half at that time of doing what we do today. And ClearIP provides really a whole suite of services all in kind of one dip, we call it. You send one SIP invite to the platform, and it can do a very wide variety of things, from stir shaken obviously being a very big popular one right now, to toll fraud prevention, least cost routing, um, as well as a number of other functionality.
Nice. Yeah. I mean, the platform has been around for a while, so it's a very well-known platform. So the main thing. So last week I was at a conference called TAD Summit, and many of the speakers had topics that were related to fraud prevention and similar aspects. And of course, stir shaken is the word that comes up most often. So I'm curious, what's your well, first of all, what your experience with stir shaken is, but most importantly, what is the direction you see there? Is it being adopted? Is it working out as it should?
Yeah, so I think stir shaken is an important piece in the problem of robocalls and solving the problem of robocalls. But there's a couple things that really make stir shaken have, well, it's not as functional as I think it's going to be right now.
Okay, yeah,
And
that's where I wanted to go. It's everybody seems to think it's going to magically make robocalls go away, but I'm not that convinced.
Yeah, sorry, we just had a power blip and the printer's restarting. So the yeah, stir shaken. Well, maybe a quick rundown on what stir shaken is really doing will help. So stir shaken provides a mechanism for the originating service provider to attest whether they know that the subscriber placing the call has a right to use the telephone number they're using or not. And in doing that, it also provides a mechanism for that originating service provider put their name on the call and say, I'm the provider that's originating this call. So that terminating service provider can know, okay, this call came from this service provider and this is what they know about the call. It doesn't tell you, this is a robocall or this is not a robocall, but that information is really important, for quickly identifying the service providers that are facilitating robocalls, and and taking corrective action on that, whether that be done by the terminating service provider, so by doing something like marking those calls as spam, or whether that be by the FCC or regulatory bodies in general for providers that are knowingly originating robocalls. It's historically been relatively expensive to stop some of these robocallers because you spent a long time doing traceback, figuring out where they came from, eventually get people to shut them off, and then they just come right back with a different company name. But StirShaken will make that a little bit more challenging and a lot more automated to quickly and identify them to be able to stop them. But it has to be widely deployed, and that's really where we're kind of struggling right now. I think as an industry, there are two main gaps that we see. There's the TDM gap. So any call that hits any TDM signaling or non-SIP signaling, I should say, at any point in the call path, that passport would be lost. The passport is the object that contains the cryptographically secure information for Shaken. And that's lost if it uses TDM today. There are some ATIS standards that were published, one more than a year ago, and the other one relatively recently, at least version 2 of it was. And we're expecting that the FCC is going to be mandating those standards for the TDM portions of the network in the relatively near future. There's actually currently a notice of inquiry out with comments due, I think, less than a month from now at this point. So that's the first big gap that we see. The second big gap that we see is where providers, service providers, are not implementing StirShaken. They are letting their downstream provider implement StirShaken and thinking that that meets their regulatory requirement when it really doesn't. And of course, it doesn't, because it makes StirShaken relatively useless. The way I'll describe it is, if you have an intermediate provider that's aggregating traffic from a large number of originating service providers, if that intermediate provider is the one who signs the call, what does that really tell everybody on the terminating service provider? Okay, you lose the ability to say this service provider is one who's originating all the robocalls, because all you see is it's coming from the intermediate, which is often what you see
it's
now.
really
You're
you.
getting
Right. I knew it was you. It was you before you told me. I didn't need to actually.
Exactly. I mean, if you exactly, it almost is like, what's the point? I got the call from you. I know you, but you're not the one who's originating it. It's downstream who's coming there. And I think we're starting to see more service providers understand that having the downstream provider, one, is useless for Shaken, and two, it does not meet, at least in the US, the regulatory requirements that the FCC has. I mean, it's not that every call has to be signed. That's not what it says. It says that every originating service provider has to sign their calls. And that, as that improves, as well as the TDM gap, I think we're going to get closer and closer to a point where the StirShaken information, the passport, is on every call, which will really improve the ability of analytics engines to take action on calls that don't have it, and more accurately judge what's going on with those calls that do have it.
So how do we fix the TDM segment? What are the initiatives? I try to maybe explain some terminology first. TDM will be the old style telephony network, the PSTN is saying. Some people know it as PSTN. It's exactly the same thing, but it's close to being the PSTN. So phones, the copper lines that go into everybody's houses and just connect there. How do we fix that? What initiatives are in place?
Yeah. So I'll kind of run through, but I want to mention one thing first. So the StirShaken is originating service provider to terminating service provider. It's not originating handset or phone UA to terminating phone, right? So the good news is, it doesn't matter what is between the originating service provider and the subscriber that is their customer. If you have a twisted pair out to a phone, that's fine. It's once it gets to the service provider, then it needs to be IP for StirShaken to work. So we don't have to go, rip out all the twisted pair going out to residents. We just have to rip out the twisted pair, the T1s, going between service providers. So it's a lot less, although there is still a lot of it. So, I mean, obviously there's the first solution, which is have those transition to IP. and have those use IP. And that is something that I think everybody's wanted for a really long time. Everybody's been talking about the IP transition to full IP network for, this is not an exaggeration, decades. It hasn't happened. It's probably not going to happen in the relatively near future, but eventually it will happen. And so we're left with trying to find a solution for that TDM leg in between two carriers. And there are two solutions that have been published by ATIS. The ATIS is the standards group in the U.S. that has developed all of the shaken standards, as well as a lot of other standards. And the first one I'll talk about is out of band shaken. And the name basically tells you what it does, right? It sends the passport out of band, out of the signaling. Specifically, it's across the internet over the portions of the call that use TDM. And then when it gets back to SIP, it puts it back into the passport, back into the SIP invite, just sends it downstream like nothing was different. The second solution is something called extending stir shaken over TDM. It's basically a way of taking a passport or some information from a passport, I'll say, and encoding it in the ISEP UUI, the user-to-user info. And that has a fairly limited size. And so it's a fairly complex encoding to really reduce the amount of data. I mean, if you think about the size of a signature and then, you're trying to fit this into something that really needs to be about 100 bytes, you don't have a lot of space. But it is possible to do if certain criteria are met. It only works with the shaken passport. It doesn't work with, forwarded calls that have both shaken and div. So there are some limitations, but it can get a shaken passport across the TDM link.
Oh well, so there are ways to handle that. Plus, I think we need special. I mean, one would think we could need special devices over. I mean, the PSTN side. How do you actually know who the call is coming from and interpret the results? I don't know if I'm like. Most phones won't be able to display the information we're talking about.
Well, yeah, and the truth is, most phones can't do it on the SIP side either. Really, the way that we've found, and I think the way that a lot of people do it, is to modify the caller display name, which is supported by anything, whether it be a modern SIP phone or a POTS line, twisted pair to a POTS line. Yeah, they can do that. So that modification of caller display name is really the way that you indicate to that subscriber that this call was verified.
Yeah, there's that's probably going to be the only way. So as far as the other problem you talk about is general adoption. Isn't something mandated by law at this point, or was it just a design there?
So stir shaken was mandated a couple years ago. There were some extensions that were given to certain providers. Initially, anyone who was a small provider had an extension. If you had less than 100,000 subscribers, you had an extension. The FCC actually kind of walked that back a little bit and changed it. So it was originally a 2-year extension. They reduced it to 1 year for small providers, unless they were facilities based, and then for them they left it at 2 years. So at this point in time, everybody is mandated to implement stir shaken except small subscribers that are facilities based and subscribers that are using TDM. So the small subscribers that are facilities based, they have an extension until the end of June 2023.
So not too far in the future.
Yes, not terribly far in the future. And also, I think the FCC kind of looked at that and said the facilities-based providers that are small, probably not a big source of robocalls. So I don't know that is a particularly big problem. They're not like transit providers or anything like that. That these providers aren't. There maybe was some logic to their plan there. Although certainly, some of them could be committing robocalls, and getting shaken on every call is beneficial, even for the calls that are not robocalls. But then the big one is the TDM, and that we're expecting the FCC is probably going to have a ruling, first few months of 2023. They're going to kind of come to their final decision. Comments are due, I think, December 7th, and then second, follow-up comments will be in January. So a few months after that, the FCC will have made a decision, and I would assume that they're going to mandate, they're going to remove the extension. Is really what the way to
Oh,
say it is, right? They had an extension for TDM, and they're going to remove it, which means you have to implement the non-IP solutions or switch to IP. What that time frame is going to be, I don't know. If I had to guess, June 2024. June's been the time, but we'll see.
so removing the extension means they remove an exception. Effectively, it's called extension, but
Yes.
it's actually more of an exception or a waiver for a certain type of traffic.
I think, yeah, they call it an exception, and I'm saying I always try and be a little careful with that term. I think a lot of people realize, oh, I'm excluded from the requirements. It's actually, most of them have a time frame. Other than the TDM, all of them had a time frame. They weren't really, permanent, and they actually still require you to do certain things. It's just the STIR shaken implementation isn't required. So just to be clear, there you still have to file a robocall mitigation certification. Every service provider has to have filed a robocall certification as of months ago. So that's long past, and it doesn't matter if you have an extension or exception, whatever you want to call it. There are a number of things that have to be met.
So how can let's put it this way: both of our companies and many people who are listening probably provide services to companies that do call centers, outbound dialing, and all of the stuff. What does someone who does? So we have a very good customer, a friend of mine, who does medical reminders. So what they do is they have a platform where you can go sign up, and they will call you. It's usually for elderly people, right? They will call you, and chatbot will ask if you took your medication, how you're feeling, and log all that stuff. How do they make sure they're compliant?
Yeah. So the first thing I think that is critical is who is the originating service provider? That sounds like a simple question, but the FCC actually really muddied the water with, or really Congress did, with the Trace Act, which greatly expanded the scope of who is considered a service provider. So that's really the first question. You need to identify who the originating service provider is of that call, because often it's further down than you think it is, or further upstream, I should say, closer to the handset. And that originating service provider has to file a robocall mitigation certification, and they have to make sure that robocall certification, accurately describes what they're doing. And then, of course, they can't, file one that says I'm not doing shaken if they don't qualify for one of those extensions that allows them to not implement shaken at this time. So that's really the first thing. And then, of course, that is only part of it. You have to perform know your customer. You have to make sure that you're not originating robocalls. So a common point of confusion I hear, when you go to file that robocall mitigation database certification, it's, you have three choices. I've completely implemented STIR shaken, just check it. I've implemented STIR shaken for part of my network, partial STIR shaken. And then you have to file a robocall mitigation plan. What are you doing to stop robocalls? Or I haven't done shaken. And again, you have to file that robocall mitigation plan that says what you're doing to stop robocalls in your network. If you check complete shaken, you don't have to file your robocall plan, but you still have to do it. A lot of people don't realize that. Originally, you only had to do robocall mitigation if you weren't doing shaken. But the FCC, I think, quickly realized that shaken and robocall mitigation are not the same thing. They're not trying to solve the same problems. And so they reversed course quickly and said, everybody has to do robocall mitigation. So that's a common point of confusion. And really, what that means, make sure you're monitoring your network. If you're seeing, abnormal volumes of calls, getting complaints, you need to perform know your customer. All these types of things that you could expect. Are what's required.
So robocall mitigation will be a set of actions you take internally to make sure your customer as well. In case this is one level down from what me and you are used to, your customers are actually not performing robocalls, including monitoring, checking for call rates, checking for destinations, call duration, and all of that stuff. Cool.
Yes,
So yeah,
exactly. The FCC was non-prescriptive on what that looks like. They didn't say you have to do exactly this. They just said you have to do a good job, and how you choose to do that will give you some leeway. But if you file your plan, if you're required to file a plan, not everybody has to. If you completely done complete stir shaken, and your plan doesn't look good, the FCC has in the past, and they will continue in the future to say, hey, this does not meet, the requirements that we meant,
guys,
even though they're
this doesn't look great.
Yeah.
It feels like to me that it's kind of like how most of software security works. Like you're not mandated. There is a set of common rules. You're not technically mandated to do this or that, but it's very, very recommended to work within a set of guidelines, certifications. You don't have to have them in most cases, but it's common sense, which to me is the worst way to regulate something, because people will do the darndest things, but it's still technically good.
Yes.
A good starting point. People will really do the darndest things if you let them. That's the main.
Yes, absolutely.
That's the main thing. Cool. So regarding ClearIP in general, do you mainly have customers in the US? Are you worldwide?
I mean, the majority of our customers are definitely in the U.S., but we have customers. I think we're missing Australia and Antarctica, but every other continent besides that, with ClearIP. So we've I'm waiting for someone from Australia to get on ClearIP. But I'm not hopeful for Antarctica. But yeah, no, we do have a range of customers. Definitely North American market focused. A fair amount of Canadian customers as well. I mean, Canada has deployed stir shaken, as well, in their infrastructure. So ClearIP supports both the U.S. and Canadian deployments of stir shaken.
In fact, that's a good follow-up question. How many countries across the world have implemented something like stir shaken? I'm from Europe. I live in Italy, and I don't think we have anything like that coming, at least in our country. Might be other places in the EU. So is stir shaken really just a North America kind of thing?
Right now, yes. France is going down that road of stir shaken. I'm not as involved in that as I have been in the U.S. and Canadian. So I don't know the timelines, but they're much. France is doing stir shaken. There's some slight modifications that they've made just to adapt to their networks, to the stir shaken standards. But fundamentally, it's stir shaken. And so at least in France, they're going to be. As far as other countries, I don't know of anybody who's really gotten that far along. I think I've heard a lot of different providers. The UK, there's been discussions, but France is certainly the only one that I know of that's gotten substantially down that road.
It's certainly strange how Europe is not following up on that stuff, since we have a very good GDPR and data protection regulation, and I think it's weird that Europe hasn't taken steps in that direction. I would say we also have slightly less of a problem with robocalls. They are there, but the numbers are probably lower because of existing regulation.
That may be a big part of it. I think the robocalls has been the number one complaint to the FCC for a very long time. So there's a lot of incentive from really everybody, regulators, customers, even service providers to some extent, to solve this problem. So that's probably been a big part of that. And I suspect, I don't have numbers on which countries get the most robocalls, but I suspect Canada, just in the fact that the numbering plan is shared with the US, sees some bleed over from that, and probably has somewhat similar numbers as far as robocalls go.
Yeah, I think Europe is just a little bit more insulated from robocalls because of existing regulation. So there's already a bunch of rules around who you can call what and why, and that certainly helps. So I think that's the starting point. Of course, not everything. Like, of course, you can't really get everything done, but it's still helping. Well, then I think that's a great starting point. So how when do you think we're going to see store shaking implemented properly? Sometime 2024?
I think a big question is really just going to be, when is the TDM mandate, or removal of that extension going to go into place? I would say that's really going to be the major change. So yeah, right now I would estimate probably June 2024. Just assuming that that's really when the mandate's going to be, because that will force every call to have shaken. There will be no more reasons a call can't have shaken. And so if a call doesn't have shaken, that doesn't mean it's bad, but that becomes much more suspect, right? That becomes a much bigger indicator than it does right now. Our statistics have basically shown that our customers, a lot of them who rely on TDM or who rely on transit providers that have a fairly large number of TDM interconnects, they see about 25% of their calls come in signed. That's the current system. So I think there's been some people I've heard, stir shaking isn't working. Well, it's not really been deployed right. It's not been fully deployed, and 25% of the calls come in with stir shaken. It really limits what you can do with that information. Now, you're going to see very different statistics depending on the network. If you go look at what the big wireless carriers see, where the majority of the calls they get are from the other big wireless carriers, where they have direct SIP interconnects between each other, they're going to see a lot higher numbers as far as what percentage of the calls are stir shaken. Interestingly, where they're going to see high percentages of stir shaken is on the good calls that wireless to wireless. On the calls that are coming in from other networks, then they're not going to see as high rate. That's where all the robocalls are. But then there's also plenty of legitimate calls on that network. So we'll see. But I would estimate right now June 2024, assuming that's when the mandate is.
Yeah, so it's a usual situation where, unless there's a clear mandate from the government, people would just sort of half do it, right? Try to pretend they're doing something, but then it's not.
The biggest problem with TDM is the guys in the middle. It's the intermediate providers in the middle, actually. And they really, understandably, have no incentive to do anything about it. It's not their calls. They're not, they don't have a relationship with the end user on either side, the originating or terminating end user. So they don't really care. It doesn't really benefit them to implement stir shaken. It's just cost. So it's a little understandable, but they're transiting those calls. They need to transit a passport, and that regulatory requirement is going to, I think, pretty dramatically change those ratios of calls that come in signed versus calls that don't have an identity header.
Yeah, I think that's where it starts. Well, thank you so much, Alec. It was it's always good to find out how the future looks like, because it's really what we're trying to do here. So again, thank you so much for joining us today. It was a pleasure, and Stir Shaken is going to be a big player. SignalWire also has, just a little plug, SignalWire also has an open source implementation of Stir Shaken called libStirShaken that it's used by Camilio and Frizzwich, of course, Frizzwich and Camilio too, amongst others. And I think it's a good implementation. There's a lot of interesting stuff going on there. So maybe take a look. I don't know if you'd like to help out. That's just great. Comes with a simple command line tool that enables people to do their own signatures, and it's easy to use in third-party platforms, because you can shell out and check the certificate from the shell instead of having to build into your own software. It's good for small implementations. It's good for a lot of little stuff. So, well, take a look. Let me know how it goes. And thank you, Alec, again for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
And well, for the rest of the people, I see you next week. Goodbye.